Usually when we talk about history on this deep dive, we're looking at maps. We visualize borders moving and empires expanding.
Right, like a giant game of Risk.
Exactly, like a game of Risk. But looking at the stack of sources you pulled for this one, specifically looking at European industrialization between 1815 and 1914, I'm realizing we should probably be looking at a graph instead.
Oh, a graph is definitely the better visualization here. I mean,
Yeah.
it's really the only way to grasp the sheer magnitude of what happened.
Because if you look at a graph of human economic progress like GDP per capita or standard of living for the last, I don't know, 10,000 years, it's basically a flat line.
Yeah, it wiggles a bit. You get good harvests or a plague, but generally it's entirely flat.
Right. And then suddenly, right around 1800 or 1815, it shoots strictly vertical. It just goes to the moon.
The famous hockey stick curve.
Yeah.
It represents the single most significant shift in human history since we invented agriculture. It's that exact moment humanity broke out of the Malthusian trap.
Where population growth always outstrips food production.
Exactly. We broke out of that and entered this entirely new era of sustained growth, transitioning from handmade to machine-made.
But the catch, and this is really what we're digging into today, is that the line didn't go vertical for everyone, not at the same time and definitely not in the same way.
No, not at all. There's this big misconception that the Industrial Revolution was this uniform wave that just gently washed over Europe.
Right, like the steam engine is invented and suddenly everyone from Manchester to Moscow wakes up, drinks a coffee, and builds a massive factory.
Which is completely false. The reality, as all the source material shows, was radically uneven. It created a massive divergence, this huge split between the haves and the have-nots that basically dictated the geopolitical winners and losers of the 20th century.
So our mission today is to unpack that divergence. We're looking at three distinct models that emerge from the sources. You've got the sprinter, which is Great Britain. You've got the gradualist, France. And you've got the stagnators, which is Southern and Eastern Europe.
And just to set the stakes early for you as you listen to this, we aren't just talking about who made more cotton shirts or who had the shinier trains. We're talking about why some nations became global superpowers and why others fell into catastrophic famine. This uneven evolution determined who survived the 19th century.
So let's start with the outlier, the leader of the pack, Great Britain. Why them? I mean, looking at the map, Britain is a relatively small island, kind of off on the periphery of Europe. Why did the lightning strike there first?
It's the classic historical question. Why not China? Why not France? The sources point to a perfect storm of three factors: geology, finance, and politics. You really need all three working in concert to get that spark.
Okay, let's take geology first. You're talking about the actual dirt.
I am, but it's not just having the resources, it's where they are.
Yeah.
Britain sat on massive, massive deposits of coal and iron ore. That is the hardware of the industrial age.
You need iron to build the machines and coal to power them.
Right. But crucially, in Britain, these deposits were often near each other and they were near water transport.
Which totally solves the logistics problem. Because we have to remember, before trains, moving heavy stuff was an absolute nightmare.
It was prohibitively expensive. The friction of distance was incredibly high.
Yeah, if you had to move coal 20 miles overland by horse and cart.
You lost your profit margin entirely.
Yeah.
Britain had a natural advantage with its coastline and its navigable rivers, but they also doubled down on that natural advantage by building this intricate network of canals in the late 18th century.
So they effectively terraformed the island to make it a machine for moving fuel.
Precisely. They drastically lowered the cost of energy. But you also need the software to run the hardware. You need money.
And that's the second pillar, financial muscle. By 1815, Britain had the most sophisticated financial system in the world.
They had a central bank, the Bank of England, which provided stability and, more importantly, trust in the currency. And they had a culture of investing. In many other parts of Europe at this time, if you had money, you bought land.
Right, that was the only respectable place to park your wealth. You buy a giant estate and just play Lord of the Manor.
Exactly. But in Britain, you had a wealthy class of entrepreneurs, some coming from the old cottage industry, some from colonial trade, who were actually willing to risk capital on new technology.
To put up the scratch for a factory.
Yes. And because the banking system was so mature, interest rates were comparatively low. Borrowing money to build a massive textile mill wasn't financial suicide. It was just a calculated risk.
Okay, so you've got the coal, you've got the cash. But the sources mention a political dimension that seems really crucial here. The government wasn't standing in the way.
No, they were actively clearing the path. This is a big difference between Britain and the absolute monarchies on the continent. By the 19th century, especially after the Reform Act of 1832, the British Parliament wasn't just a club for aristocrats with big backyards anymore.
It began to represent the interests of the industrial class, the new money.
Exactly. And that political environment really allowed for those famous technological catalysts to take root. You know the names from school, James Hargreaves and the spinning jenny, James Watt and the steam engine.
But it wasn't just that they invented them, it's that the society was structured to adopt them rapidly.
Right. Invention is one thing. Adoption is a whole other beast. And if you want to visualize just how far ahead Britain was in adoption, you just have to look at the Great Exhibition of 1851, the Crystal Palace.
I love this detail from the sources. A structure made entirely of cast iron and plate glass, 3 city blocks long, built right in Hyde Park.
It's a stunning image. But think about the engineering required to mass-produce that much glass and steel. Literally no other country on Earth could have built that building in 1851. And inside, they showcased something like 100,000 objects of innovation. It was a giant victory lap.
And the famous detail, they built it around existing elm trees.
Which is heavy, heavy symbolism. By enclosing living ancient trees inside a man-made industrial shell, Britain was saying to the world, we have mastered nature. Technology is now the dominant force.
But mastering nature is one thing. Mastering the economy is another. The sources highlight a specific policy battle that really cemented Britain's industrial path, and it involves corn.
The repeal of the Corn Laws. I know it sounds incredibly dry, but it is arguably the most important political decision in 19th century British economic history. It was essentially class warfare fought through the tax code.
Can we break that down? Because
Yeah.
I think a lot of people hear corn laws and tune out immediately.
Sure. So corn here refers to all cereal grains, mainly wheat. The Corn Laws were high tariffs, meaning taxes on imported grain. The landed elites, the old nobility, they loved these laws because they kept the price of British grain artificially high. It protected their profits.
But the new industrial class, the factory owners, hated them.
Right. And here is the economic loop you really need to understand. If bread is expensive, workers need higher wages just to survive. If wages are high, factory profits go down. The industrialists wanted cheap bread so they could pay lower wages and still have a fed, functioning workforce.
So it really was old land versus new industry. Who actually runs the country?
Exactly. And in 1846, Parliament repealed the Corn Laws. They chose industry.
That's a massive signal. The government effectively said, we are no longer an agrarian nation, we are a manufacturing nation.
And the effects were immediate. Cheaper grain flooded in, wages could be stabilized, and the workforce could expand. It drove people off the farms because they couldn't compete with cheap imports anymore, and into the cities. It cemented Britain's total commitment to free trade.
And they kept that innovation engine running with things like the Royal Society of Arts, right?
Yes, institutional incentives.
Yeah.
This is a key takeaway from the sources. The British system offered prizes, patents, and social prestige for inventors. If you built a better mousetrap, you didn't just get a pat on the back, you got paid and you got famous. The whole culture incentivized disruption.
Okay, so that's the British blueprint. Resources, capital, and a government that actively pushed for industrialization. Now let's cross the channel. Let's look at France. The sources call them the gradualist.
France offers such a fascinating counter-narrative because they looked across the water at Britain. They saw the smoke, the slums, the cholera, the sheer social upheaval in places like Manchester. And they said, maybe let's not do that part.
We want the wealth, but not the revolution.
A little bit of that, sure. But they also faced a major resource reality check. France simply did not have the coal and iron deposits on the same scale or accessibility as Britain. They literally couldn't just copy-paste the British heavy industry model because the geology didn't support it.
So if they can't sprint, they have to find a different lane entirely.
Correct. France adopted a model of a dual economy. They kept a large agricultural sector, they didn't empty the countryside the way Britain did, and they focused their industry on high-value luxury goods: silk, fashion, fine finishing.
Quality over quantity, which feels very French.
It really does. But the biggest structural difference between the two was the role of the state. In Britain, industrialization was driven by private cowboys entrepreneurs taking personal risks. In France, the state had to step in to build the skeleton.
Because the private capital wasn't deep enough.
That and the infrastructure requirements were just harder. Look at the Quentin Canal. This was a project initiated under Napoleon to link the coal fields of the north directly to Paris. It was a massive engineering feat that private companies just couldn't finance alone. The state had to build it to make industrialization even possible.
It's the same story with the railroads later in the century, right? The government was much more hands-on.
Yes, the French government designed the network, acquired the land, and built the roadbeds themselves. Then they leased the operation out to private companies. It was a public-private partnership long before that was a buzzword. They had to deliberately bridge the gap between the resource-poor areas and the industrial hubs.
It seems like a much more managed, top-down approach.
It was pure state sponsorship, and it worked for them. By the mid-19th century, France had a modern cotton industry and a completely revived silk industry using adopted British technology, like the jacquard loom. They didn't dominate the world in raw tonnage of steel, but they created a stable, wealthy industrial economy without the total social dislocation Britain suffered.
So Britain is the explosive disruption, France is the managed evolution, but then we have the rest of the map, Southern and Eastern Europe. Places like Spain, Portugal, Italy, Russia, the Habsburg Empire. The sources label them the left behind.
This is truly the tragedy of the 19th century. While the Northwest is taking off, the South and East are largely stagnant.
Why? Was it just bad luck with the geology again?
Geography is the starting point, certainly. Spain and Italy really lack coal. Plus, think about the terrain. Spain is incredibly mountainous. Italy is bisected by the Apennines. Before tunnels and advanced rail systems, moving goods across those countries was a nightmare.
No water transport, no cheap fuel. Really hard to run a factory under those conditions.
It's a very bad hand to be dealt. But the sources argue pretty convincingly that the bigger problem was social roadblocks. Even if they had the resources, the social structure was designed from the top down to prevent change.
This goes back to the landed nobility we talked about with the Corn Laws in Britain.
But on steroids. In Britain, the nobility eventually compromised with the industrialists. They adapted. In Russia or the Habsburg lands, the landed nobility held absolute power, and they viewed industrialization not as an economic opportunity, but as a mortal threat.
Because factories create a working class, and working classes tend to demand rights.
Exactly. If you are a Russian czar or a Habsburg emperor, you look at the French Revolution, you look at the labor riots in British cities, and you think, I prefer my peasants right where they are, thank you very much. They incentivize the status quo.
And speaking of peasants, we really have to talk about serfdom here. It's wild to think that well into the 19th century, a huge chunk of Europe's population was legally tied to the land.
This is the critical labor issue. You cannot have an industrial revolution without a mobile workforce. You need people who can leave the farm and move to the city to work the machines. Serfdom makes that literally illegal.
So in Russia, even if a guy somehow wanted to build a factory, he couldn't hire anyone because the workers physically weren't allowed to leave their village.
Right. And even after Russia formally abolished serfdom in 1861, the terms were so restrictive, the peasants had to pay these massive redemption payments to their former masters. So they were effectively trapped by debt and communal obligations anyway. They remained in primitive subsistence agriculture.
So you have a lack of resources, a government that actively fears change, and a labor force that is stuck in the Middle Ages.
It's a perfect recipe for stagnation. And this isn't just about economic graphs looking bad. The divergence had a horrific human cost. Which brings us to the Hungry 40s.
This was a period of severe crop failures across Europe, right?
Yes. But the impact of those crop failures depended entirely on whether your nation had industrialized. The industrialized nations had what we call economic diversity. If the wheat harvest failed in England, it was bad. But they had factories exporting goods, they had cash reserves, and they had a massive fleet of ships to just buy grain from America or Ukraine. They had a buffer.
But the non-industrialized nations,
They had absolutely no buffer. They were mono economies completely relying on agriculture. If the crop failed, the entire economy collapsed. The most heartbreaking example of this in the sources is the Irish potato famine.
Now, Ireland is a complex case because politically it was part of the UK, but economically it looked a lot more like the non-industrialized South.
Exactly. Ireland had been systematically underdeveloped. It lacks the industry of England. The population was almost entirely dependent on a single crop, the potato grown on these tiny subdivided plots of land.
So when the Blight hit in 1845,
The primary food source vanished overnight. And because there was no industrial wage economy to fall back on, and because the British government refused to intervene with sufficient aid clinging to these free market dogmas that worked great for factories but not for starving peasants, the result was an absolute apocalypse.
the numbers in the sources are staggering. 1 million dead, 1 million more forced to emigrate.
It's the starkest possible contrast of this whole era. On one island, Britain is building the Crystal Palace, this gleaming cathedral to technology. On the island right next door, people are starving in ditches because they are trapped in a pre-industrial agrarian system.
That really drives home the so what of this deep dive. Industrialization wasn't just about efficiency or making things faster, it was a literal survival mechanism.
It completely reshaped the hierarchy of human survival. The haves gained the ability to withstand major shocks, famines, wars, economic downturns. The have-nots were left completely vulnerable to the whims of nature.
So when we look at the map of Europe in 1914, right before World War I kicks off, the die is already cast.
It is. You have the industrial core Britain, and by then Germany, which caught up incredibly fast booming with steel and munitions. You have the industrializing periphery like France. And you have the brittle agrarian empires of the East Russia and Austria-Hungary, which were militarily and economically hollow.
And that imbalance explains so much of why World War I played out the way it did.
It really does. The Russian Empire didn't just collapse in 1917 because of bad battlefield tactics. It collapsed because it couldn't sustain a modern industrialized war with a pre-modern economy. The railroads failed, the supply lines failed, the people starved.
It's a powerful lesson. We often think of technology as just new gadgets, but in this context, it was totally existential.
Absolutely. It defined the very ceiling of what a nation could achieve and what it could endure.
So to wrap this up, if we step back and look at the big picture, British disruption, French management, Eastern stagnation, what is the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, today?
I keep coming back to that concept of incentives we touched on earlier.
How so?
Look at the difference in leadership. Britain structured its laws to reward risk and innovation, even when it was painful for the old guard. They accepted the massive disruption of repealing the Corn Laws to get the growth of the factories. They let the old world die to birth the new one.
Whereas the Eastern powers protected the old guard at all costs.
They incentivized safety. They protected the landed elites because they feared the instability of the new. And that exact decision ultimately destroyed them.
It really makes you think about our current economy.
It does. The provocative thought I'd leave you with is this. In the modern economy, who are our landed elites? Are we writing laws that protect legacy industries just because they're comfortable and politically powerful? Or are we willing to endure the discomfort of disruption to build the next Crystal Palace?
Are we the British Parliament of 1846, or are we the Russian nobility?
That is the question. And history strongly suggests that choosing comfort is the most dangerous choice of all.
A very sobering thought to end on. We hope this deep dive changed how you look at that 19th century map, and maybe even the graph of your own investments.
Indeed. Keep questioning the data.
Thanks for joining us. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.